So you guys came to learn some stuff, I guess. But before we do that, I'm going to give you a quiz. I know you wanted to be the one asking the questions, but let's switch things up a little bit. How many of you have heard of Murphy's Law? Okay. How many of you have heard of Newton's Law? Okay, cool. Make it a little tougher now. How many have heard of Moore's Laws? All right. How many of you have heard of Cole's Law? What? It is amazing. You take chopped up cabbage, you put some creamy... Sorry. Shouldn't come to these things hungry. All right, okay. So 3 professors and a preacher walk into a church. There's not really a punchline, that's just what's happening tonight, so... Yeah. All right, I'm going to stop now while I'm ahead. My name is Dee Dee Collette. By day, I am an information technology professor. I also serve on the elder board here at Living Water Church. And I want to welcome you. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your week, out of your busy lives, to just come and hang out with us tonight. In a society that's kind of, I don't know, judgy, a little opinionated, kind of quick to call names or even destroy relationships sometimes. Tonight I just want to ask you guys not to look at this as a go get 'em sort of thing, but more of just an opportunity to open up your heart, open up your mind. However you came in those doors, whether you're a Christian, whether you're an atheist, whether you're an agnostic, skeptic, not really sure what you are, that's all right, totally cool. I just want you to be able to learn not only to kind of like reaffirm your own beliefs, but also to understand the full picture, where everybody else is coming from too. Because things could get a little intense. These guys are super passionate about what they do. This is awesome. But when we walk out of here today, I want everybody to be able to shake each other's hand. I want us to be able to fellowship together. By the way, there is so much food out there. And ultimately, just be able to respect and love each other a little bit more, maybe, because we understand where the other side is coming from. So, enough about that. Let me introduce you to our second professor of the evening. Our moderator for tonight is going to be Franklin Miller. He received his PhD at MIT in engineering and applied physics. He spent 5 years at, I don't know, you might have heard of it, NASA, in astrophysics technology, including work on the James Webb Space Telescope. He is currently an associate professor of mechanical engineering and physics at the UW-Madison. So now, please welcome me. Please not welcome me, join me, whatever. Welcoming the man, Professor Franklin Miller.
Good evening. Thanks for showing up. It's really good to see all of you here. I'm going to go through the rules first, then do introductions, and I'll have a few comments. So here's pretty much how it works. We're going to have 3 stages to the debate. The first stage is going to be 20 minutes in the first round to each of the debaters. And Isaac and Larry have talked ahead of time, and Isaac's going to start, and Larry's going to go second. And so we'll have 20 minutes, then we'll have 10 minutes after that each for rebuttals, and then finally 5 minutes each for closing comments. At that point, we will open the floor up for questions. I'll have some additional rules when we get to questions, but we won't talk about those yet as far as what, how we're going to do the questions, who's going to have the mic, and all those kinds of things. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our 2 speakers for the evening. And first, I'd like to introduce Isaac Fleming. He's the pastor here at Living Water Church. Pastor Fleming completed his master's degree in divinity at Asbury Theological Seminary with a focus in the philosophy of religion. So this is what we're talking about tonight, right? He has spent the last 5 years teaching college students debate on moral and ethical issues, and Pastor Fleming has participated in several debates on moral issues in the public forum in the last several years. Okay. Professor Larry Shapiro from the philosophy department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison will be arguing for the atheist point of view. Professor Shapiro is an expert in the philosophy of the mind and the philosophy of psychology. He completed his PhD in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. His recent interest in the philosophy of religion has led to a book which was published in 2016. The title of the book is The Miracle Myth: Why Belief in the Resurrection and the Supernatural is Unjustified. Professor Shapiro has also participated in several debates on moral issues and also belief in the supernatural. So, I have a few comments. So, it's really good to see so many people out here on a Wednesday night when you could be watching the playoffs, the Brewers, right? I mean, right. So it's good to see that you're coming out and deciding to think instead of just vegetate in front of the television or watch baseball. So I really appreciate that. And I really think it's important. So I thought about this a little bit and I said, we really have a broad spectrum of people here. We have people who have viewpoints that are really across the board. We have people who are atheist and agnostic and skeptic and deist perhaps, and then theist, and maybe we have some polytheist people here. So it's just a wide range of people. But we do have something in common. We've come here, we want to think, we want to reason, and we want to learn more, and we want to search for truth. And I think that's a very valuable thing. And this really became evident to me. I spent 5 weeks in China this past summer with some UW students, and it was interesting. I was on a college campus there, and the environment is entirely different from a college campus here in the U.S. In the U.S., there's lots of opinion, there's lots of debate. Everybody's talking about their idea about politics and about philosophy, about what they think about the world, and none of that existed because it's forbidden, right? This event wouldn't happen in that country because there isn't an open forum to discuss these kind of ideas. And so I really think we are in a unique position in human history. Think of being an atheist during the Spanish Inquisition, or an agnostic, or you just had some different viewpoint. Think of being, having some religious view in Soviet Russia. So we're in a position here. We have some privilege here that we can come together, talk about things, really bounce our ideas off one another, and really develop our ideas. And I think unless we do that, it's really hard for us to say that we really have ownership of our own ideas or we have fully developed ideas. Because I think our ideas need to evolve as we interact with people who have different ideas and opinions. Because one of the things I noticed in China is there was a uniformity of thought, because I hadn't realized this until I was immersed in the culture, that when you limit free speech and you limit access to information, what you're really limiting is thinking. And we have a privilege here tonight to be able to look, to sit down or stand here and have a conversation with someone with a very different viewpoint and see where that goes. And we will be different in the end because of this. Our ideas will evolve and change, and that's a good thing. We should be thinking and be civil about it. So with that, let's get started with the debate.
So I'm beginning, and I want to begin by saying thanks to everyone for coming. I also want to say thank you so much to Larry for coming. He's kind of on my territory tonight. I am the pastor of this church, and so I just consider it to be an honor to be here with him and that he's here with me. I also want to point out that since I am a pastor, I want to start off my argument by saying that I don't want my argument being judged on some religious authority. I won't be arguing from any Bible verses tonight. I won't be talking about what any popes have said or what any catechisms have said. I'll be talking as best as I can from arguments and evidence, and I hope that you can evaluate that on that basis. So I want to begin with an argument on how a believer in God's existence could be rational in that belief. There's a little bit of a statistic from the Pew Forum that shows that somewhere about 90% of the people across the world believe in something, like the divine or God, or put a name on it. Now, majorities definitely don't make for truth. I hope everybody can see that. But I think that it might be telling of something about the naturalness of the belief in God. That there's something perhaps very basic about that belief that we can sort of kind of build upon and see its value, that absent of any major problems with that belief, one could be rational in holding that belief. There's a philosopher originally at Notre Dame, just recently moved on from there in his retirement. He proposes that it's properly basic to believe in God like certain other beliefs that you and I hold to every day. So for instance, you and I hold to beliefs based on perception. They usually form quite involuntarily at first. We hold beliefs based on memory, and we hold beliefs based on testimony, and we don't have to go here tonight, but there's also beliefs based on other minds, like how do I know you have another mind? Rather than I know I have a mind, but how do I know you have a mind? So there's some interesting questions there which I don't get excited about right now. But there are very natural, or a person just sees it to be that way. They sort of kind of come to the knowledge of that belief. And God's existence could be a belief like this. What if belief in God is very similar to perception, memory, or testimony, or something like that? Now, I'll give you an example of this. Let's say you wake up and you think it's the morning because there's a bright, warm light shining in your window. And so you get up, you perceived it to be the case that it's the sun, and you go downstairs like you're going to start your morning. This belief sort of auto-formed. It sort of just took place. You saw it to be that way. Now, a belief like this could be defeated, and I want to get that word in our vocabulary tonight. So the sense of being defeated would be, let's say you went downstairs and your mother's there, and she says to you, oh, son or daughter, go back upstairs to sleep. That wasn't the sun shining in your window. It's not morning. Your dad is on the roof setting up really powerful Christmas lights, and for a while was beaming those lights in your window. Well, you would instantly change your belief because your belief in the sun was out is now defeated by another belief. And so I think that this is a good example of how the same thing could be true with God. So any believers that are here or anywhere in the world could be, and I'm not saying all believers are rational, so you know, but some believers could be rational in a similar way that we're rational in holding these other beliefs. And the way of maybe showing that they're not is simply coming up with a defeater for God's existence. In other words, just like the mother in the morning, maybe there's some keen bit of evidence out there that would show us that God doesn't exist very clearly. So until that case is, my challenge for the night of anyone here is, are there any strong defeaters for the belief that God exists? And if not, I would propose that believers are in fact rational in holding that belief until that comes along. Now, independent of that, we're not just going to stop there. Maybe some believers aren't rational, but is there another way of maybe thinking about the existence of God? There are a number of arguments that have been utilized over the centuries and refined and refined and refined. Something about philosophy and age-old questions, they just never go away, right? I think Larry understands, at the very least. We get in, but there is progress on these sorts of questions. So independent of my first argument, I think there are positive reasons to think that God exists. One philosopher called it, there are 24 or so arguments for God's existence. I encourage you to Google that document, check it out, 24 or so arguments. But tonight, non-believers and believers agree upon various portions of reality. And I want to talk about these portions of reality, and I want to make an argument that on the case of theism, now we use the word theism. For those who are not familiar with that, it just means the concept that God exists, the belief that some kind of an all-powerful, all-good being exists. So that's sort of the concept of theism. And so if I use that shorthand, just think I'm talking about God's existence, okay? All right, run along with me here. But I want to argue that a number of bits of evidence that we're all aware of are less surprising given a theistic worldview, given the worldview that thinks God exists rather than a worldview that thinks God doesn't exist. The first bit of evidence for that is the universe itself. Now, anyone who's looked at the arguments is very familiar with this next argument. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument. It's an argument based upon the universe. What better explains the universe? Say God or no God or something else. So the argument is this. It's in two stages and then a conclusion. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. Pretty simple, right? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, let's examine the premises just a little bit. The first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. I think this is obvious. The fact is, the atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie, who is no longer alive, but he had an argument here that said this is one of the most intuitively obvious principles. He says this is constantly confirmed in our everyday experience. And so we might come up with examples. If this table had a beginning, it needs a cause. If this building had a beginning, it needs a cause. If people had a beginning, they need a cause. So the first premise, at least in his mind, is very intuitive. The second premise, I think, has been getting more clear. The second premise is this: the universe began to exist. Now, I don't know where everyone is at on this subject, but over the last 80 years, there's been a lot of confirmation for the hypothesis that there was this Big Bang at some point in the distant past. Now, whatever we think about that, I think that I want to use this as an argument to show that the universe does in fact have a beginning. Stephen Hawking, hopefully most of you know that name. If not, you need to read A Brief History of Time at the very least, and then reread it again because you probably have to try to figure things out in there again. But nonetheless, he gives credence to this an idea of an initial beginning, although he ends up offering a different explanation for it. But I want to make that point. Moreover, other astronomers, such as Robert Jastrow, have also agreed that the universe had a beginning in this Big Bang, some point in the distant past. And that brings me, if that's close to the right premise, that brings us to the conclusion that the universe has a cause. If it has a beginning, it has a cause. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Isaac, what in the world does that tell us about God? You know, like, we know something about the universe now, but what in the world does that get us on the God subject? Well, of course, we could ask the question, what caused the universe? Why is there something rather than nothing? Those sorts of questions have been seeded in and discussed almost ad nauseum in the philosophy departments, but nonetheless, it's a good question. And therefore, I want to argue a line of reasoning that could maybe get us to an understanding of what caused the Big Bang, if it's accurate. Here's the thought here. From nothing, nothing comes, of course. We don't see things popping into existence out of nothing regularly. In fact, it'd be quite a unique world if we did. A bicycle just popped into existence there with no cause. So something brought something from nothing, apparently, which is the interesting part about the Big Bang. So whatever brought it about was powerful. Whatever brought it about didn't seemingly have to, because early on in those early milliseconds of the Big Bang, all the constraints sort of go away just prior to that. In other words, this being doesn't have constraints. It's not forced to bring a universe about. It seemingly, or the thing, whatever it is, makes a choice. Sometimes people think of things making choices as being a personal thing. Whatever brought it about was not physical, because all of the physical things in the universe came into existence at this point. So whatever did it was non-physical. And whatever did it wasn't in time, because time gets going shortly after the start of the Big Bang as well. So whatever did it was timeless. Now, my thought here is that theologians have been calling God these things for centuries: powerful, personal, non-physical, and timeless. So I want to propose that I think that the universe is better explained given theism than given atheism. Next, morality. How about we all say morality? I'm kind of an audience participation guy. In fact, it's been hard getting through my first line there without doing it. For those of you who know me, you will understand. Besides the universe, there is morality. And the neat thing about morality tonight is that, and it was surprising when I learned this, is that Larry and I both agree. I think I agree, if I heard his last debate right, that he believes in absolute morality. So this is going to be a unique discussion tonight, I think. Now, one could ground morality, the existence of right and wrong, if you will, in personhood. And I think there's another line of argument. What worldview better grounds personhood? That's a discussion. But tonight I'm going to offer one that seemingly has been more intuitive for people, even though it's not my favorite. It's this. It's two premises and a conclusion. If absolute moral values and duties exist, then God exists. Absolute moral values and duties do exist, such as discrimination is wrong, or infanticide is wrong, or you could list a number of other ones, I'm sure. And therefore, God exists. So if absolute moral values and duties exist, then God exists. Now again, we both agree on morality. The question is what can better ground that morality? So you might ask the question, well, fine, Isaac, morality exists, but why on earth does that get us to God? And here's my thought on why it could get us to God. I think there needs to be some kind of an objective standard, something that doesn't go towards our own desires or our own preferences. It sort of stands beyond that at some level. And what I want to say is that Christians aren't putting God forward as, hey guys, God is a really great explanation of morality. He seems to fit the puzzle piece, that's it. No, I want to reverse that I actually think that morality demands some kind of ultimate being. Maybe we don't have the greatest definition of this at this point, but I think that it demands some kind of ultimate being, something with personal qualities, and here's why. Say you get a great opportunity of looking in a telescope. Now, not just any telescope, Hubble's telescope. Somewhere deep into the distant galaxies you can look, and it's really a cool experience. Go on NASA's website and follow that. That's a lot of fun. But you look deep into the distant galaxies, and you notice there's this standard written in the stars. And it says, well, here's a various list of good character attributes. You should follow these character attributes or become like these character attributes. Or maybe we even find the 10 Commandments etched into the heavens somewhere. Now, at this point, if they're not connected to anything, and they're just somehow up there in the stars, it doesn't matter. Morality doesn't matter under this thesis. I mean, really, they're very arbitrary. I mean, you would just look and say, well, now, I'd be interested in Franklin's view on this, actually, but you'd be thinking like, well, now that's just interesting coincidence, isn't it? Some sort of a standard in the sky. And my point is to say is that if it's not connected to some character, then there's no good reason to think we should conform our own characters to something good and to something moral. So that's my argument. Now, I need to be clear. I know Larry already knows this, but maybe not everyone in the room knows this, that this argument is not saying, and I'm definitely giving believers a little chop in the ribs here, this argument is not saying that atheists are bad people. Unfortunately, every time this argument is presented, someone leaves the room with thinking that that's what we're saying. So that's actually not what we're saying. In fact, I will go on record for saying that Larry is a good man. And I thoroughly enjoy him. And as far as philosophers are concerned, I really like his work, and I would even recommend his book, The Miracle Myth. I mean, it actually has some really good stuff in there. And also, I would like to say, I know there might be more in the room, but AHA came by. It's an organization at UW. They treated me with such grace and respect the other day. Atheists can be very good people sometimes, if not better than believers, right? So I hope that's clear here tonight. But I'm asking a question of which is more likely to describe why we have some standard to reach to, why we have some standard of perfection to go after, why we can make sense of Martin Luther King Jr. advancing society rather than that being some other retrograde somehow. So that's my thought there. And here's the thought. Atheists have often felt the pull of this argument. C.S. Lewis, a former atheist, he didn't just become a Christian like that. It was a multi-decade pursuit. But he was shocked when he found out this argument. He thought, oh my goodness. Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, some of you might have heard the name. He helped crack the DNA code. You know, pretty exciting stuff. He's now the National Institutes of Health head. I mean, he's quite the scientist. He said after he was an atheist in his 20s, and at 26, 27, he started encountering this argument. He said, faith in God now seemed more rational than disbelief. The philosopher Michael Roos also, he's an atheist philosopher. He's a naturalist, and he's not going to agree with Larry tonight, to be sure. They're different on this issue. But he argues this. He says, I just denied that absolute moral values and duties exist. Therefore, the argument doesn't follow. The argument, and he would be right, if you deny the first premise, it doesn't get to a conclusion. Maybe there aren't absolute moral values and duties is what he says. I mean, clearly in his mind, there aren't. But here's why he says this. He says, because if I'm going to try to prescribe to somebody what they should do, he says, I'm going to have to look at all of the things that people are doing, but that's only going to get me a description. It's not going to get me a prescription. And he calls it the wall of the is-ought fallacy. Just because something is does not mean it ought to be, and therefore he sees it as a stopping point, gives up the first premise. But I don't think we should give up the first premise. I think absolute moral values and duties exist, and I think they're better explained given theism than I think atheism. My final argument in my last few minutes is this. Besides universes, which we agree upon, or a universe at the very least, besides morality, which we agree upon, there's also one other thing we can agree upon tonight as being a fact, and that's rationality. Atheists and theists alike cherish reason, and rightly so. But my question is who has a good reason for thinking that reasoning is good and is valid in the first place? The philosopher, a Christian philosopher, Michael Peterson says, and he helped start the journal Faith and Philosophy, which helped influence Antony Flew, former unbeliever, became a deistic believer. He writes this: in what kind of universe, described by what sort of philosophical worldview, would we expect to find creatures with the powers and capacities of reasoning that we have? If naturalistic atheism is true, is the argument. If the belief that there is nothing supernatural in reference to there's no God is true, then all we have is evolution. And evolution should aim our thinking at survival value, not at truth. This is agreed upon by Michael Roos and others as well. And the point, and actually, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but clearly we know that there is truth, and clearly our minds are pointed at truth. So the question is which offers a better explanation for rationality? My argument would be that theism offers a better explanation for why rationality is pointed at truth. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, who's no supporter of Christianity or belief in God, says that materialism or naturalism and evolution together cannot explain the non-apparent qualities of the world, things that you wouldn't think to be so, really. In other words, if evolution is true, naturalism is false, is the argument. So if evolution is true, without a God, then it would lead us to think that our rational powers are not important, or at least not important for truth value, but our rational powers are important for the truth, so we can clearly know that naturalism should be false. So, at the end, I conclude that reason and rationality is better explained given theism and evolution rather than naturalism and evolution. So, Taken together, we have a number of various realities that we agree upon tonight. And likely we're going to quibble over the interpretation of those various realities. But taken together, I think we have a good case for theism, or the belief that God exists. And I will end with a quote by C.S. Lewis, who said this: I believe in Christianity, or we might put God there at the moment. I believe in Christianity or God as I believe that the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because I see everything else by it. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming, and thanks especially to Isaac for providing me with this opportunity. Let me start with some distinctions that will be important. First distinction is a distinction between proving that God does not exist and arguing that we're not justified in believing in God. I'm not going to try to prove that God does not exist. I don't know how to prove that something does not exist. I can't prove that mermaids don't exist. I can't prove that Bigfoot doesn't exist. I don't believe in mermaids. I don't believe in Bigfoot. I don't believe in God. What I'll be doing is trying to convince you that the evidence we have for belief in God falls short of justifying that belief in God. This is true even if God does exist, right? Did it rain on this date 10,000 years ago? I don't know. It either did or it didn't. We're not justified in believing either way. That's my stance on God too. although that's my official stance. As I said, I don't believe in God, but I'll get to that in a minute. Why is it hard to prove God's existence? It's hard to prove God's existence because we don't have direct experience with God. That means we need to depend on arguments of the sort that Isaac was given. What best explains some range of facts? Isaac chose to think about the origins of the universe and rationality and morality, and I'll talk about that in my response to Isaac after my opening statement here. I'll talk about some of that in my opening statement as well. So the good news is we have a pattern of inference, a kind of argument that justifies belief in things that we don't directly observe. This is called inference to the best explanation, and it's what Isaac was relying on. And what I want to do is explain the limitations of this kind of argument form and show why, given those limitations, it's not an argument form that's going to get us justified belief in God. And because it's the only argument form we have that can justify belief in God, that means that we don't have a justified belief in God. Okay, so the good news is we have an inference that allows us to have justified belief about things we don't observe. The bad news is it's not going to work for God. Okay, so what sort of things does this kind of inference justify? Well, how did that newspaper get on your stoop this morning? You didn't see anyone deliver it, but we can reason backwards. Well, if that stoop got there, there must have been someone who put it there. That's the kind of inference, the best explanation. But we just take for granted that it must be a newspaper delivery person. If we want to be open-minded, we should be willing to consider various hypotheses. Maybe a newspaper deliverer person put it there. Maybe God put it there. Maybe aliens put it there. These are all hypotheses, and I'll be referring to these sorts of ways of explaining facts, like the newspaper on your stoop, as hypotheses, and I'll talk about the fact as an observation. So what we want to do when we're doing an inference to the best explanation, we want to consider a hypothesis that will explain some observation. Hypothesis. Some paper boy or paper girl put that newspaper on your stoop. Okay, so that's an inference to the best explanation. Why was infant mortality higher when doctors were delivering babies in the mid-19th century than when midwives were? Well, we can't see a cause of infant mortality, but we can make some hypotheses, and this was what led to the discovery of the germ theory of disease. Doctors were moving from the dissecting corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands. Midwives didn't dissect corpses, and so their hands were cleaner. And we infer there must have been something invisible on the hands of these doctors, and we think about that hypothesis. It explains some of the facts, and so we develop more evidence, and we come to a justified belief that there are these microscopic things called germs. That cookie jar is empty. Who stole those cookies? In my house, there were always two hypotheses because I had two daughters. I have two daughters. Thalia and Sophia. Those are my two hypotheses. Which hypothesis do you prefer? Trick question. You have no idea. You have no idea because we need to make some assumptions that we can combine with this hypothesis, and then together, that hypothesis, Sophia or Thalia, combined with these assumptions, will allow us to explain the observations. So, the cookie jar is empty. Was it Sophia? Was it Thalia? I didn't see who took it. Those are my hypotheses. Some assumptions. Sophia's messy. Observation, there are crumbs all over the counter. Another assumption. Sophia loves chocolate, and these cookies were chocolate. Thalia's neat. Thalia hates chocolate. Okay, now my two hypotheses can be combined with these assumptions, and we can make an inference to the best explanation. It was Sophia. Easy, right? Here's something to notice. those assumptions I made are independently verifiable. If I want to know why, here's what I want us to be thinking about tonight as I talk about various hypotheses and assumptions. Always ask, well, how do you know that? How do you know Sophia is sloppy, is messy? Well, look at her room. There's all the evidence you need. I verified that assumption. How do you know Sophia likes chocolate? Well, look at all the chocolate candy wrappers lying on the floor of her room. I verified that assumption. Okay, so what makes my inference to the best explanation one that justifies my hypothesis that Sophia stole the cookies? Because I have some assumptions that, combined with that hypothesis, entail those observations, the empty cookie jar, and I can independently verify those assumptions. Okay. So let me say now, provide you with three general sorts of constraints that any inference to the best explanation has to meet if it's actually going to do the work of justifying some belief in a hypothesis. First thing, the assumptions with which that hypothesis is combined have to be verified or verifiable. Okay. I could look at Sophia's room and verify that she's messy. I can look at the candy wrappers and verify that she likes chocolate. So that passes that test. Second, the assumptions that I'm combining with my hypothesis can't be ad hoc. What I mean by that is we can't propose these assumptions for the sole reason of making our hypothesis the more likely one. Suppose my wife, who would refuse to believe that Sophia stole the cookies, said to me, I think it was Thalia, and I think it's Thalia because she's just the kind of girl who would frame her sister. That's an ad hoc assumption, assuming that we have other reasons to think that Thalia is a nice person and wouldn't do that. The only reason to make that assumption is because she wants her favorite hypothesis to turn out to be the right one. So that's an ad hoc assumption. It's not been verified. It's been stipulated for the purpose of making some favorite hypothesis come out true. Third condition, okay, so assumptions have to be verifiable. They can't be ad hoc. And they can't assume what you're trying to prove. Suppose that my wife had said, well, it can't be Sophia because I'm assuming she would never do that. Well, when you assume she doesn't do that, you're as much as saying it had to be Thalia. So this is an assumption that is, in technical jargon, begging the question. It's assuming what you're trying to prove. Okay, so inference to the best explanation is the kind of argument we need to justify belief in something we don't directly observe. It works by thinking about various hypotheses, and you could think about scores of hypotheses, as I'll show in a minute. Thinking about these hypotheses, thinking about what assumptions we need to make to combine with these hypotheses so that they predict the observations we're looking at. And those assumptions that we're combining with these hypotheses have to be verifiable. They can't be ad hoc, and they can't assume what we're trying to prove. Okay, that's background. Now, let's get to work. You hear some scratching noises in your attic. Okay. What's causing it? We need to make an inference to the best explanation. Here are some hypotheses. Squirrels, bats, ghosts, none of the above. Those are all hypotheses. And just as when I initially asked you who stole the cookies, was it Thalia or Sophia, and you had no idea because you don't know anything about Thalia and Sophia, just assume that we don't know anything about squirrels, bats, ghosts, or none of the above. So what's the best explanation for the scratching noises in the attic? Well, we need to make some assumptions. Here's an assumption about squirrels. They They like to go into houses. Can we verify that? Yeah. Some of us live in houses where squirrels have been. And then, because we know that squirrels do things like eat nuts and make little squirrel droppings, we can go into an attic and we can observe nuts and observe squirrel droppings. Now I've made some assumptions that, combined with my hypothesis, entail some observations. If we go into the attic and we find leaves and squirrel droppings, then I've justified my belief that it's squirrels that are causing the scratching. Likewise, bats. What do we need to assume in order to make the bat hypothesis entail the observation of the scratching noises in the attic? Well, that bats hibernate in houses, and they've got nails, and they make bat droppings. And so then we can go up into the attic, and we could look for these things, because we're able to verify those assumptions about bats. We verify them by observing bats in attics, observing that bats produce bat droppings. Okay, so both those hypotheses can be combined with assumptions, and given those assumptions that we're independently able to verify and those hypotheses, we can decide between them. What about ghosts? Now, I said you should be wondering, well, how do you know that? How do you know Sophia's messy? Well, because of all the crap in her room. How do you know that bats like houses or go into attics? Oh, because I've seen some. Okay, now let's talk about ghosts. What do we have to assume about ghosts in order to make it the case that we ought to expect that a ghost in the attic will be producing scratching noises? Well, we can assume that ghosts like to live in attics. Hold on, how do you know that? Well, I don't know. Or suppose you were to say, well, I bet it is a ghost, and it's a ghost that, for some reason or other, left a lot of squirrel droppings on the attic floor. That would be ad hoc, right? That's to say, I really like that ghost hypothesis, and in order to preserve that hypothesis, make it the one that we ought to believe, I'm going to make some stuff up. I'm going to make up that they leave squirrel droppings. That's ad hoc. Or suppose you were to say something like, well, it had to be a ghost because nothing natural could make those noises. Well, then that's begging the question. That's assuming what we're trying to prove, because we're wondering whether something supernatural like a ghost can make those scratching noises. And if you assume that something natural could not, that's assuming that something supernatural must. So that ghost hypothesis, throw it away. It does not justify our belief. We don't have a justified belief that a ghost caused those noises in the attic, because we can't verify independently the assumptions necessary to make that belief entail the observations. Some of the assumptions might be ad hoc, and some of the assumptions might assume what we're trying to demonstrate. Could be none of the above, too. We might decide, who knows? Who knows what causes scratching in the attic? Don't know. How am I doing on time? Five minutes. Okay. You see some clouds in the sky on Christmas morning. They form a pattern that says, God is great. What on earth caused that? Or not on earth? Hypotheses. It was a prank of some kind. It was God. It was a super powerful entity who lacked the Christian characteristics of being all good and all knowing. Or it was something that we can't understand. Which of those hypotheses should we accept? Well, it does say God is great, and it is Christmas morning. Was it a prank? Well, for it to be a prank, we'd have to assume that people are capable of manipulating clouds, and as far as we know, they're not. So that's an assumption that needs to be combined with that hypothesis, and we can't verify it, so throw away that hypothesis. What about God? Well, if God is the right hypothesis, we have to assume something about God. Like, he would want to announce with clouds his greatness on Christmas morning. Hold on, how do I know that? I don't. I can't verify that assumption. Because I can't verify that assumption, I can't combine it with my God hypothesis to generate that observation. What about that super powerful entity who is not God? Well, same thing. In order to get the observation of the clouds in that pattern on the assumption that that supernatural entity is responsible for them, I have to assume something about that entity. It wanted those clouds there. But I have no way of verifying that. And so neither the God nor the super powerful entity hypothesis justifies belief that it was one or the other of those things. What about simply can't explain it? That's one I like. All we have to do to assume that the best hypothesis here is one of, I don't know. I mean, it's not really an explanation. It's just a concession that some things happen we don't understand. Why should the world be designed in such a way that everything that happens we can understand? Okay. Finally, the origin of the universe. Well, you know what I'm going to say at this point. Big Bang, that's one hypothesis. God, that's another hypothesis. How about an entity who's not all good and is in fact bad, and he's the one who created the universe? Well, what do we need to assume? Well, the Big Bang hypothesis, to my mind, has the most going for it, because what we have to assume is that there was a big explosion, and we have good reasons for thinking there was a big explosion. We see the leftover heat in cosmic microwave background radiation. We see galaxies flinging themselves at an increasing rate farther and farther away from ourselves. That's what you'd expect from an explosion. So that's all pretty good. What about God versus the evil guy who likes to create universes? Well, what do we need to assume to make those the right hypotheses? Things that we can't verify. I might say, well, it's obviously the evil guy because he probably wanted to create war, a world with a lot of war on it because he likes to watch people kill each other, and, well, he got his way there, right? And then someone else says, no, it had to be God because there's all this good stuff going on, and that sounds like God. But now we're just making stuff up. We have no way to verify these claims. And given that we have no way to verify these assumptions that have to be combined to these hypotheses in order to generate the observation of the existence of the universe, we can't be justified in the belief that it was God, or was that the evil God, or any number of other things. So in short, inference to the best explanation is our best hope for understanding how things we don't observe were brought about by these invisible presences. But given the kinds of constraints on these inferences, the need to verify the assumptions, the need for these assumptions not to be ad hoc, and the need for these assumptions not to simply not to take as given what they're trying to establish, inference to the best explanation doesn't get us justified belief in God. Thanks.
So Isaac, go ahead and proceed with your 10 minutes of rebuttal.
Okay, I want to begin by saying Larry said many good things. It's also, we went out to lunch the other day, and I think we both agreed that sometimes believers And also sometimes non-believers overstep their reach on questions, which is why I really do believe a night like tonight is something that Larry and I really share something in common, that we really want you and the whole world to be better critical thinkers, hence fake news. So we need some better critical thinkers, so I know that we share this common goal, and we can work together on getting there, I believe. So a couple quick comments and then into some specific rebuttals. I guess the question about no direct experience of God is an interesting one to me, and I'm not here to argue about what kinds of experiences are valid and what kinds of experiences are invalid, but I guess the only question would be is, we would only know there's no direct experience of God if we priorly assume there's no direct experience of God. So that's my first point. The next point, the three constraints that the inductive argument basically needs to get to, I agree with them. Assumptions must be verifiable, although I would ask the question of what constitutes verifiability, but we'll get into that in a little bit later. Not ad hoc. I think I dealt with this because it wasn't so much so me thinking that the universe offers a powerful explanation. The people that I quoted were actually not believers, they were non-believers, and they would continually say that this opens up the God hypothesis. So this isn't just something like I'm trying to force this in that direction. Moreover, my arguments assume that this is a philosophical worldview issue. You have a philosophical worldview, whether you've thought about it or not. I have a philosophical worldview. Larry has a philosophical worldview. We're all going to have to bring it. You can't just lay that aside and looking through the evidence. That's why I've framed this argument as which worldview better explains the evidence that all of us agree on, universe, rationality, and morality. So that's why I frame that argument this way. I think it's incredibly important that we see this as a philosophical worldview and which philosophy has the tools to really engage with all of reality. And I've argued that that's theism, or the belief that God does exist. Although I will say I do agree with Larry that not everything has to have a reason. I had to agree with something. I do actually agree on more than that. But here's my definitive rebuttal tonight, what I think could be close. That I think there's a lot of similarities. I read Larry's book, and he might be able to distinguish from details about this later on. But there's a lot of similarity between his view and a person by the name of W.K. Clifford, who wrote a paper on the ethics of belief. It's a very good paper in many ways, but it has some difficulties. And he says this: it is wrong always and everywhere and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. This is W.K. Clifford. Now, I think Larry might nuance that a little bit. He might say, well, one is never justified without enough evidence. Might be the way he's framed it tonight, if I've done that justice. So here's my response. First, that belief that one is never justified without enough evidence doesn't necessarily pass its own test. What's the amount of evidence that we have that that statement is always true? And that's, if it can't pass its own test, it fails its own test. There is no evidence to think that it's true. Thus, by its own standard, it's false. Second, what constitutes evidence is actually the thing in question tonight. What can people utilize as evidence for a set of justified beliefs is actually the point in contention tonight. What makes for good evidence varies from person to person. Anyone who disagrees with Larry's personal standard tonight, or my personal standard tonight, is simply off the hook for believing what we believe. So it's person relative. Third, if Larry is correct with that high of a standard of justifying beliefs, then Peter Van Inwagen, a philosopher, is correct in saying that we all have to be agnostics about most historical, political, and scientific questions. That we all have to be agnostics. We don't want to put our senses of, there is no sense of justification in dozens and dozens of questions that many of us think are probably the case on a regular basis. Fourth, also, it's hard to see why one is not justified as a believer, or perhaps in something else, or even an atheist in certain circumstances, why one is not justified in their belief in God, in this case, if they have not strived to ensure that there is more evidence for their view than against their view. They've tried to turn everything over. Why are they not justified in thinking that God, in fact, does exist? Which is my point today. Also, let's go to one of his major arguments, the argument in reference to inductive reasoning. to the best explanation? I would say that it does typically work, but it doesn't work in this situation if there is actually a better explanation, is my point. He's generally correct, but he's not necessarily correct here, and here's why. First, thinking a view is better, best, or equal, or less good. I can think of a worst, I guess. Thinking a view is better, best, or equal, or worse is person relative. It's based upon what you think. It's based upon what Larry thinks. It's not necessarily based upon some objective standard. Perhaps if there is some objective viewer who could tell us there is some sort of an objective sense of justification, maybe we could get there. But until then, our standards are all person relative. And therefore, that's why I offered that there was plenty of evidence to think that God does in fact exist. Second, if naturalism is true, the belief that there's nothing supernatural, thus there is no God, if naturalism is not true, then it's off the table of possibilities. It's actually the worst explanation, which was partly my argument tonight, that if it doesn't explain these major portions of reality well, then maybe I haven't proved my case for God, but I've definitely proved my case against the naturalistic standpoint. And so atheism is off the table. But theism does explain these realities very well, and that's, I guess, the question. Now, he mentioned only lightly Bigfoot. I hope there is no believers in this room tonight. But I will let him do the survey, because I don't want to know. I think the answer to something like this, and which is why something like this really doesn't work in case someone's thinking it does in reference to God, is simply that believers in Bigfoot have overstepped. They have heavy defeaters. Every argument that they'd ever had has a heavy defeater for. So, therefore, Bigfoot has been defeated. But the question is, are there any good defeaters against God? And I think we're still looking for one. Now, I know that wasn't Larry's argument tonight, but it's been very hard over the years to find a defeater to give up that belief. So I propose that. Now, I know I'm getting close to the end of my time, but one of his major arguments is, how do we know if there's one God, two gods, 17 gods, major power gods, smaller power gods? Well, my thought here is, first of all, if there's 1, 2, or 17, atheism is wrong. So at least we're on this side of the ledger tonight. But one could be sure, where am I now? I have no idea. Oh, one could be sure on divine things or think they're sure on divine things and not sure about all the details of those divine things. I see no reason to give up a belief in God's existence just because I don't know all the details of the divine. Again, it pushes us to this side of the ledger to think that there is some kind of divinity out there, regardless of the number. But next, if God is defined as an ultimate or necessary agent, an agent of intentionality, if that's how we go about defining God, then we may not know all the things about all of the spiritual beings out there, if there are, but we know that there's at least one ultimate being. In fact, is to say that there are two ultimate beings ends up running into all sorts of problems. And I cite to you Richard Swinburne's The Coherence of Theism. He's a philosopher at Oxford, to flesh that one out. Moreover, anything less than pure actuality leads us to the greater being anyway. In other words, like the universe is contingent. In other words, it doesn't self-exist, which is why it needs a necessary being. I propose that God is the necessary being. The universe is contingent. It doesn't rely upon itself for its own existence. So God is necessary to this existence of this universe. But nonetheless, anything less than pure actuality, let's say there was 20 gods and none of them are pure actual, none of them are necessary, that just leads us back up the chain. They're contingent too, and thus it still leads us back up to the chain to one great God. Fourth, this assumes that there's no revelation. For instance, what if there is revelation? If there is a God who exists and he's tried to make himself known to people through the years, thus revelation would have offered us an avenue of true knowledge about what this being or beings are like. So I think this argument assumes that there's no such thing as revelation. And so, in other words, I think that we can get a long way by reason and we can get a long way of confirming that reason by revelation. And just because I'm a Christian and I thought I'd throw it in for the night, if Jesus is who he claimed to be, God in human flesh, and he told us there's one God, then that could settle the issue. But I'll leave that to you to think about. Now, I know I got 1 minute left. I want to conclude in my first rebuttal phase. that my case tonight has offered you a cumulative case of what we call antecedent probability. Which philosophical worldview best explains the realities that we're all well aware of? And I propose to you tonight that it was theism, or the belief that God does in fact exist. Moreover, when we think about things like the universe or morality or rationality, they at the very least push us away from naturalism. And I think that's a good direction to go this evening. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to get to all 43 of Isaac's counterarguments. Let me start with something that I'm hoping you're going to take back, because I didn't know you were a relativist about truth. This idea that evidence is our own personal standard can't be right. I mean, just think about the consequences of such a view if we said, well, what counts as good evidence for you doesn't count as good evidence for me. This would make progress impossible. Imagine a granting agency having to decide between different scientific proposals. What's the agent going to say? Well, this counts as good evidence for this person, so let's give them money. Well, that's good evidence for that person. Let's give them... No, some evidence is better than other evidence. This is an objective matter. The fact that you've flipped a coin 1,000 times, it's landed heads every time, is good evidence that that's a biased coin. Just is. That's a fact. Okay, so now, particulars. To say that God is the best explanation of these sorts of things, first of all, I don't think God is an explanation at all of these things. How is saying, well, there's a universe and we don't know how to explain it, so God. Why is that an explanation? Here's an explanation. How does a clock work? Well, you take it apart, you look at the gears, you look at the spring, you have an explanation for how the clock works. If you don't know how a clock works and someone says, oh, I don't know how this clock works, and someone says, God, that doesn't really explain it. That doesn't explain anything. Now, let's turn to particulars. The universe. You have a cosmological argument, but it's an argument that is just resting on intuitions that you can't verify. You say, it just stands to reason that everything has a cause. Well, no, it doesn't. In fact, there are cosmologies, like the Big Bang, where scientists are rejecting the idea that there had to be some cause. It's not at all obvious that everything has a cause. You might choose to believe so because it makes your argument work, but then that's assuming what you need to prove what you want to prove. So that's a fallacy. Morality, what best explains morality? Plato, hundreds of years before Christ, made an argument that has never really been successfully defeated by theists who look to God as the source of morality. Here's a way to make this argument tangible, I think. Suppose you thought that things are right because God is our guide and God says it's right. So God says murder's wrong, murder's wrong. God says being charitable to refugees is good, so being charitable to refugees is good. Okay. Then God wakes up cranky one morning, says, you know what? Let's make murder good today. And let's make selfishness and greed good today. And let's make promise-keeping really bad today. Okay. So does that mean now that promise-keeping is actually bad and that murder is actually good? I hope not. Now you say, well, God would never say that. Well, why not? Because murder's wrong. Because promise-keeping is good. So God is not the source of morality, Plato pointed out. God may know what the moral truths are, but God can't make murder good by saying it's good. There's some standard, some objective standard about what counts as morally good and morally wrong, and maybe God knows more about this standard than the rest of us, but he doesn't make that standard, because if he did, moral truths would just be arbitrary. It would just be a matter of what God decided to call good and God decided to call bad. So God certainly is not a good explanation for moral truths. Now, rationality. In fact, we're not very rational. Psychologists have a lot of fun in their laboratories demonstrating how irrational people are. Quick example. Let me tell you a story about Linda. Linda is, she's got lots of piercings. She wears Bernie Sanders t-shirts. She works at the local soup kitchen. She's active in the Me Too movement. Which do you think is more likely? Linda's a bank teller, or Linda's a bank teller and a feminist? Who thinks the second one is more likely? Who thinks the first one is more likely? And a lot of you don't think anything. Well, it's a law of probability that A is more probable than A and B. It's more probable that she's a bank teller than that she's a bank teller and a feminist. People get this wrong all the time. People are not very rational. That ought to make you wonder if you think that God is responsible for our rationality, because it turns out he did a poor job designing us then. And evolution, in fact, can explain limitations on our rationality because we grew up, we evolved in selection environments that prized some kind of reasoning that involves, say, stereotypes and hasty generalizations, because these proved to be more adaptive than purely rational reasons. So if we want to look at the actual phenomenon, we could say, well, it was evolution by natural selection, or you could say, oh, it was God, just as God decided to make us less than rational. But now we're just making stuff up again. We have no way to verify that God actually wanted to design us with imperfect rationality. One of Darwin's great insights was that organisms are not perfectly designed. They've got all these vestigial organs. They've got all sorts of maladaptations. Why does it hurt so much for a woman to give birth? Well, it's because her cervical opening's like this and the baby's head's like that. Well, why would God have done that? Now we can make stuff up. Well, God thought it was important that a woman experience pain when she has a child so she doesn't have too many children. We could make stuff up like that. Or we could make assumptions about the inheritance of certain traits from ancestral conditions. It seems like those are the better way to go. So I think that any kind of inference to the best explanation of the sort that Isaac is making, where God is supposed to be the explanation, either doesn't really explain anything. It's a God of the gaps. We're saying, we don't understand, so God. I read today that scientists are perplexed by the frequency of tornadoes. Why are they becoming more frequent? Well, it'd be unsatisfying to say, here's something I don't understand, so God. Why is it more satisfying when faced with a deep puzzle about the origins of the universe to say, well, here's something I don't understand, so God. Why don't we say, here's something I don't understand. Let's try to figure it out. Or, here's something I don't understand. Maybe we'll never figure it out. My cat cannot learn calculus. I've been working on this. It could be we can't understand the origins of the universe. That's perfectly plausible. We know there are things we don't understand. Why do we make the inference from here's something we don't understand to, oh, God? This doesn't work. Do I have any time left? 1 minute. I don't agree with Clifford. Okay, Clifford's the guy who says you shouldn't believe anything unless you have adequate reason. That should there was a moral should. He thinks it was a moral shortcoming to believe something without sufficient evidence. I hope all of you who believe in God and find meaning in your belief in God and find fulfillment in your belief in God, continue to believe in God, because that's a great reason to believe in God. What's not a great reason to believe in God is something involving evidence. It's not there.
Okay, we'll have the closing comments from Isaac now.
Our final comments. I want to say thank you to Larry tonight, and I want to try to address some of his points in my final 5 minutes. The reason why I framed the debate tonight in the way that I have in reference to clear realities such as the cosmos, morality, rationality, is that these are agreed upon realities. Every one of us, hopefully, gets there, that these are available to us to discern and understand. And because of that, Larry has a philosophical commitment, I have a philosophical commitment, and we each have to take the tools of our philosophical commitments and ask, can they deal with the reality that we keep finding in the world? That's why. This is what I think is a much larger issue of philosophical commitments, which is why I framed it in this way. Also, I want to make a point that I didn't argue that truth was relative. I argued that various persons can have relative understandings of what can constitute for good evidence. And that's what I was arguing. I actually, again, made the argument that if there was an absolute observer, such as a God, he would have that ultimate standard of what makes for perfect evidence. Also, God is the best explanation. Again, I deal with philosophical commitments that deal with particular realities. So this is not a God of the gaps. I reject a God of the gaps too. For instance, it's like this. Oh, we don't know how the eye came about. Let's put God in the gap. But when you get to ultimate realities, when you have arguments based on contingency, that the universe is a contingent being, this is not a gap. It gets us to a necessary being. That is a necessity. That's the argument. So let's quick go over the arguments that I still have on the table. I talked about the cosmological argument, and Larry pointed out that I said that everything has a cause. But again and again and again, when I read atheistic literature, they quote us as saying that everything has a cause. I didn't say that. I said that anything that begins to exist has a cause. And if the universe began, which I tried to ground in the Big Bang, then it needs a cause. That's all I argued. So anything that exists eternal, if Frederick Hoyle was right that the universe was eternal, it wouldn't need a cause by definition. But now that we found that the universe has a beginning, it needs a cause. Morality and the Euthyphro dilemma. This is the dilemma that was posed by Larry in reference to morality. The reason God couldn't say today murder is really good and tomorrow murder is really bad is simply that God ushers commands forth from his being, from his nature, which is good. So the commands aren't arbitrary. They're actually derived from his actual being. So this is actually something that goes between the Euthyphro dilemma. Is it this or is it that? No, it's actually derived from his being, from which he gives commands. They're not arbitrary. Again, if character attributes derive from a character, we can make sense of morality. If they don't, then we can't make good sense of morality. Finally, my argument from reason. I don't think Larry said reason didn't exist. I think he affirmed it, but affirmed its weaknesses. I don't have any problem with this. Fact is, there's plenty of tools in philosophical theism, our viewpoint, to make sense of why there are weaknesses in one's thinking. But nonetheless, I think the point of the argument of rationality was strongly that if evolution is true, it doesn't direct us at truth. It just directs us at survival value. So your powers of reason don't get us to truth, yet that's what this debate is all about. We presume, we think it's good to have truth. But naturalism, that there is no God or no spiritual things whatsoever, with evolution can't get you to morality, which is why I quoted Michael Roos, the atheist philosopher, based on the is-ought fallacy. 1 minute to go. Just because something is doesn't mean it ought to be. I think philosophical commitments is what determines our outlook on these subjects. And my argument tonight is based upon our philosophical commitments. naturalism and theism, or atheism and theism, that the tools for dealing with the reality of the universe, the tools for dealing with the reality of morality, the tools for dealing with the reality of rationality being pointed at truth are better explained antecedently. They're better explained. They make better sense. They're less surprising. In an atheistic universe, you'd be surprised by all three of those things. So I conclude my debate tonight that I think my arguments actually still stand, and then I also want to conclude by saying thank you, Larry, for this night.
Isaac is doing all the things that I said you can't do in order for your inference to the best explanation to actually justify belief. Good is derived from God's own being. How do you know that? How? All things that begin have a cause. How do you know that? According to some supported versions of the Big Bang Theory, there was a beginning, but to think that there was a cause is to misunderstand the cosmology, because causes precede their effects, which means there has to be something before the Big Bang, but there's no time before the Big Bang. Now you might think, well, that's just really weird. And I agree. But it's not conceptually impossible. It's an ongoing theory with empirical support, and maybe it's not right. Maybe we don't know the right answer, but it's a fallacy to say, because we don't know the right answer, it's got to be God. You say, I'm not going to get your exact words right. Well, if what Jesus said about himself was right, something like that, well, then we ought to believe that he's God. Well, that's assuming what you want to prove. I mean, I can stand here and say, if I were God and I told you I was God, then I'd be right. But it'd be wrong for me, it'd be wrong for you to say, well, he must be God because he said so. If you're doubting whether I'm God, then my saying I'm God shouldn't convince you, because I'm just assuming what I'm trying to demonstrate. The point about reason, I'm not sure I got. I have no problem in thinking that evolution has designed us with capacities for reason. Evolution has endowed us with lots of capacities. We can breathe. We can sleep. We can reproduce. Those who have better faculties of reason, in the sense that they adapt an organism to its environment better than other organisms are adapted to their environment, will be selected for. Why this reason can't track the truth, I don't understand. Our perceptual facilities track the truth. I see you in front of me. My eyes have been evolved. It looks to me like you're there. I think you are there. My eyes seem to be giving me something true, even though it seems about as well confirmed as anything in this world that eyes have evolved by natural selection. So I think there was one more point I wanted to return to. Philosophical worldviews, which do the better job explaining things. I'm going to come back to this point again. I don't think God explains anything. I think you can posit God's existence as an explanation for something that you don't understand. But as I was saying when I was describing the constraints on inference to the best explanation, you still need to combine that hypothesis that it's God doing the explaining with assumptions that you can verify, that aren't ad hoc, and that don't assume what you're trying to establish. And I can't speak for others, of course, and I'm sure others will disagree with me, but you haven't convinced me that your arguments actually avoid those kinds of of hazards that an inference to the best explanation needs to avoid if it's going to justify belief. And one last thing. You said it again. I don't see why my example of the biased coin isn't sufficient to show that evidence is not person relative. If you flip a coin 1,000 times, it lands heads every time. That's better evidence that the coin is biased than if you flip it 1,000 times and it comes up heads 500 times. It's better evidence. And that's not because I think so. It's because of the way evidence works.
So let's thank both of our speakers here tonight, Isaac and Larry. And